Everyone laughed when a single father bought an abandoned town for just $1. They thought he was crazy and insisted that he had ruined his life and his daughter's future. But when what had been hidden underground for decades was revealed, the whole world was shocked. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The engine of the old truck rattled as it rolled down the cracked asphalt, carrying with it everything that remained of a life too heavy to bear in the city. At the wheel sat Daniel Carter, his broad shoulders stooped from years of hard labor, his hands thick and scarred from calluses that had long since hardened into permanent marks of toil. He had been a miner once, a man of earth and stone, a man who had spent the better part of his adult life underground, sweating in the darkness to earn wages that seemed to vanish the moment they reached his pocket. What he had left behind in the city was not wealth or reputation, but debt, exhaustion, and the kind of grief that hollowed a man from the inside out. His wife had died years earlier, taken by an illness they could neither afford to treat properly nor comprehend in time. Since then, he had lived as if carrying a permanent stone in his chest, the weight of it dragging his posture down, though his body remained strong. Beside him in the passenger seat, his daughter sat in silence, her face pressed against the cool glass of the window. Emily was 12, nearly 13, with dark hair that fell messily to her shoulders and eyes too guarded for her age. She had inherited her mother's delicate features, but her father's stubbornness. Her grief had shown itself in quiet ways. She did not cry often. She did not argue much either. Instead, she had built walls around herself, the kind only a child could make. Walls that closed her off not only from strangers, but even from the one person who remained to her. Though she loved her father deeply, she kept that love hidden beneath sighs and silence, convinced that showing it would somehow make her pain worse. Daniel had learned to live with her silence just as he had learned to live with his own. Words felt useless anyway. What could he possibly say to erase the absence of her mother, the emptiness of their home, or the cruel mathematics of bills and debts that had driven them from place to place? He did not talk about it, but every decision he had made since his wife's passing had been for Emily. He had no illusions left for himself. His dreams had ended long ago. But she was young, and in her he still saw a fragile possibility of life that could be saved from the slow decay that had consumed him. When Daniel had first heard about the county auction, it had seemed more like a cruel joke than a real opportunity. Entire parcels of abandoned land, forgotten properties, even whole ghost towns were being sold off for amounts of money so low they seemed almost insulting. They were leftovers of a fading frontier, places where railroads had once promised prosperity, but delivered only silence when the mines went dry or the fields failed. Who in their right mind would want them? No one in the city, surely. And yet Daniel had raised his hand and bid on a lot that no one else even glanced at, a town so far removed from the world that its name had fallen off most maps. The paperwork had been absurdly simple. A few signatures, a pitiful transfer of funds, and suddenly Daniel Carter and his daughter were the legal owners of what remained of Ashthorne, a town that had once bustled with miners, merchants, and farmers, but was now nothing more than a scattering of weathered wooden frames in the shadow of distant mountains. Family and acquaintances had laughed at him when they heard. Some called him desperate, others called him a fool. Why waste even a few $100s on ruins that would collapse the first winter storm? But Daniel had not cared for their opinions. He had not bought Ashthorne as an investment or a gamble. He had bought it as a grave, a place where he might bury his memories and raise his daughter far from the noise of a world that had already taken too much from them. The truck creaked as it climbed the final hill, and when it reached the crest, the valley spread open before them. There, stretched across the floor of the basin, like the skeletal remains of some forgotten creature, lay Ashthorne. The buildings leaned and sagged, their roofs caved in, their walls gray with decades of sun and rain. A church steeple jutted up crookedly against the sky, its bell long gone. A saloon's porch hung by a single chain, swaying gently in the breeze. The street was overgrown with weeds that pushed up defiantly through cracks in the wooden boardwalks. It looked like a place abandoned, not for years, but for centuries. Emily's nose wrinkled as she stared at it. "This is it?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying both disbelief and disappointment. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, but said nothing. He had expected her reaction. The truth was that the sight rattled even him. He had known it would be bad, but standing on the edge of that valley, looking down at the carcass of a once living town, he could not help but wonder if the laughter of those who mocked him had not carried some truth. Still, he pushed the thought aside. He had made his choice, and now there was only forward. He drove the truck down the slope and into the heart of Ashthorne. The tires crunched over gravel and scattered bones of wood. Dust rose in clouds that hung in the air long after the truck passed, as if even the earth itself resisted the intrusion of life. Daniel parked in what had once been the main street, cutting the engine and letting the silence settle in around them. It was an oppressive kind of silence, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sigh of the wind through empty windows. Emily crossed her arms and refused to move. Daniel opened his door, the creak echoing unnaturally loud. He stepped out, the soles of his boots grinding against the brittle gravel. He looked around slowly, breathing in the mountain air. For all its desolation, there was something clean here, something untouched. No honking horns, no landlords pounding fists, no constant reminder of bills unpaid. Just sky, earth, and the skeleton of human ambition. He turned back to the truck and opened the passenger door. Emily sat stiff, her eyes fixed stubbornly on the horizon. "Come on," he said softly. She shook her head but finally slid out, her sneakers landing with a small puff of dust. She looked around with narrowed eyes as though expecting the ruins themselves to collapse onto her. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that this would be their chance, but he bit the words back. Promises meant nothing after so many disappointments. What mattered was what they would build here, not what he claimed in advance. They began to walk through the street, Daniel moving slowly, Emily trailing a few steps behind. The structures loomed on either side like ghosts, their hollow windows staring at them with the emptiness of abandoned eyes. A faded sign still clung to one building, Ashthorne General Store. Another, nearly unreadable, bore the letters of a saloon. Each step they took stirred the air with the memory of lives that had long since left. When they reached the end of the street, Daniel stopped in front of a larger structure, sturdier than the rest. Its roof had holes and its windows were boarded, but the bones of it looked strong. He rested his hand against the weathered wood. "This will do," he murmured, more to himself than to Emily. She looked at him as though he had lost his mind, but he ignored her stare. He saw something she could not. Possibility. That night they unloaded what little they had brought, some blankets, tools, a box of canned food. They set up camp inside the general store, sweeping away dust and clearing a corner for their bedding. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and the temperature dropped quickly as the sun vanished behind the mountains. Emily curled up in her blanket, shivering, while Daniel fed a small fire in the old stove with scraps of wood he had gathered. The flames struggled against the drafts, but eventually warmth spread through the room. In the flicker of the firelight, Daniel looked at his daughter. She was staring at the ceiling, her expression distant and tired. He longed to tell her that everything would be all right, that they would build something new here, but he knew she would not believe him yet. He simply said, "We'll make it work," and left it at that. Emily closed her eyes, and after a long silence, she whispered, "It doesn't feel like home." Daniel leaned back against the wall, the weight of her words heavy on his heart. "Not yet," he admitted. He let his hand rest on the cold floorboards, feeling the vibrations of the wind outside. "But it will." As the night deepened, the ruins of Ashthorne settled into silence once more. For father and daughter, the journey had only just begun. Tomorrow would bring the first of countless battles with wood, stone, and despair. But tonight, in the fragile glow of a struggling fire, Daniel Carter believed, perhaps foolishly, perhaps desperately, that he had found not the end of their road but the beginning of something new. Morning came not with the brightness of promise, but with the chill that seeped through the cracked walls and the hollow bones of the general store. Daniel awoke to the sound of the wind moaning faintly through gaps in the boarded windows, its voice hollow and mournful, like the sigh of something ancient that had been left behind. He stirred beneath the thin blanket and looked over at his daughter. Emily lay curled tightly on her side, her face pale in the dim light. Her lips were slightly parted, her breath slow and even, though her brow furrowed as though she dreamed of something unpleasant. He watched her for a long moment, a silent vow rising in his chest that, whatever else happened, however hard the work ahead would be, he would not allow this place to break her spirit as the city had. He rose quietly, his joints protesting from the hard floor, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of dry earth and distant pines. Ashthorne lay before him, bathed in a thin wash of gray dawn. The buildings, skeletal and bent, seemed even more fragile in the early light. Dust lay thick across the street, and weeds, wild and indifferent, had forced their way up through every crevice. He let his eyes roam over the remnants of the town, measuring them in silence the way a soldier surveys a battlefield. There was work here, endless work. But that did not frighten him. What frightened him was the knowledge that this was all they had. Emily joined him a short while later, her hair tangled, her expression still clouded by the fatigue of their journey. She did not complain, though he could feel the weight of her dismay radiating from her in the way she held herself. She stood with her arms wrapped tight around her chest, staring at the ruins as if they were a personal insult. He wanted to tell her she would see in time, that the broken boards and crumbling roofs would one day feel like their own, but he stayed silent. Words meant little now. Only deeds could shift her heart. They set to work immediately because there was no choice. The roof of the general store sagged and leaked, letting in shafts of cold air. Daniel scavenged fallen planks from nearby structures and began to patch the gaps. It was rough work, and he had neither proper tools nor proper nails, but necessity made him inventive. Emily climbed with him, reluctant at first, then slowly giving herself to the rhythm of the labor. Together they cleared debris, swept away decades of dust, and carried broken boards to a pile at the edge of the street. The first days passed in a blur of effort. Their hands blistered, their muscles ached, but the physical toil drew them together in ways grief and silence never had. In the city they had lived side by side, each trapped in their own sorrow. Here, every nail driven, every stone lifted, became a shared act of survival. One evening, as they sat by the small fire in the stove, Emily's lips curled into something that was almost a smile when Daniel sneezed from the cloud of dust he had stirred up, pulling apart an old crate. It was the first time he had seen that spark in her face for months. He said nothing, only allowed the warmth of it to settle deep in him. On the third day, Emily wandered into what had once been a schoolhouse. The roof had collapsed on one end, sunlight spilling through to paint the cracked blackboard in the pale streaks. Among the rubble she found scattered notebooks, their pages yellowed but still legible, chalk drawings left by hands long gone, and a handful of worn wooden desks. She ran her fingers across the names carved into the wood, children's laughter preserved in silence. She carried one of the books back to her father, a tattered journal filled with clumsy handwriting, and showed him an entry where a child had written about the sudden closure of the mine. They said the mine was empty, the words read, but Papa said it still had plenty. He said something wasn't right. The discovery lingered with them, like a faint echo of injustice woven into the dust of the town. Daniel did not speak of it, but he tucked the thought away. Emily, meanwhile, began to collect little fragments of the past, buttons, photographs, scraps of paper that she stored in a box beside her blanket. It gave her something to hold on to, a connection to a place she had at first despised. Yet the hardships did not ease. The nights were bitter cold, and though Daniel managed to patch the roof, the wind still found its way inside, carrying with it the mournful sounds of coyotes from the hills. Their food supply was meager, and though Daniel rationed carefully, the weight of worry pressed on him each evening as he counted cans and bags. The old well outside the store yielded nothing but mud, and though he eventually coaxed a trickle of water from its depths, it was brown and foul-smelling. He boiled it over the fire, straining it as best he could, but he knew they would need more if they were to stay. It was during one of his trips to the well that Daniel noticed something that made his skin prickle. A set of tire tracks curved faintly into the dust near the edge of the town. They were not fresh, but they were not old enough to be forgotten either. Someone had been here recently. He followed them for a short distance until they faded into the hard ground, then returned to the store, his mind uneasy. He said nothing to Emily. She already bore enough fear without his adding to it. But that night, when the wind howled louder than usual, he kept the fire burning until the embers glowed long into the morning. By the end of the first week, their progress was visible, if only slightly. The general store was no longer just a hollow shell. It had become something like a home. The floor was swept clean, the holes in the roof patched, the stove repaired enough to give warmth. They had dragged in a pair of intact crates to use as tables, and Emily had claimed a corner where she placed her box of found relics. Outside, Daniel had cleared a small garden plot, stubbornly planting a few seeds he had saved, though he doubted much would grow in the thin soil. It was not much, but it was something. The neighbors, if they could be called that, had begun to take notice. Once a farmer from several miles away passed through with his wagon, slowing to watch them work. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between pity and disbelief. Another day, an old ranch hand stopped on horseback to offer a warning. "That place," he said, jerking his chin toward the cluster of buildings, "is cursed ground. Folks left it for a reason." He did not wait for a reply, only urged his horse on and disappeared into the dust. Emily watched him go with wide eyes, but Daniel only set his jaw and went back to his hammering. Still, amid the suspicion and the hardship, small victories bloomed. One afternoon, Emily climbed onto the roof to help her father and slipped, nearly tumbling before Daniel caught her arm. They collapsed together in the dust, coughing and laughing, and for a fleeting moment the years of sorrow fell away. Later that night, she spoke more than she had in months, telling him about the carvings in the desks and the strange drawings she had found in the schoolhouse. He listened, nodding, letting the sound of her voice fill the hollow space between them. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly the rhythm of survival became life. Work at sunrise, labor until dusk, then a fire, a meal and sleep. The silence of the town was no longer oppressive but steady, a canvas on which their efforts painted small strokes of change. Emily's bitterness softened into curiosity, her eyes no longer fixed on the horizon, but on the stories hidden in the dust. Daniel's exhaustion remained, but beneath it burned a quiet resolve. For the first time in years, he felt not like a man running from the past, but a man building towards something, however fragile. Yet beneath the fragile peace, shadows stirred. Each time Daniel ventured beyond the main street, he saw signs that they were not as alone as they believed. A fence post freshly broken, ashes of a campfire too new to belong to the long-departed residents, and always the sense of being watched. He said nothing to Emily, but the unease grew in him with each passing day. The town was theirs legally and in spirit, but there were others who remembered it too. For now, however, the battles were small and manageable. Patch a roof, mend a wall, plant a seed. And through it all, Daniel saw his daughter changing. The distance in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a tentative trust. She laughed more easily, worked without complaint, and spoke of ideas for what they might do with the other buildings. In her, he saw what he had dared not hope for. Not only survival, but the beginning of healing. The trials were far from over. The town still groaned under the weight of its abandonment, and danger lurked at the edges of the valley. But as Daniel stood one evening on the porch of the general store, Emily beside him, the sun setting in a blaze of fire over the mountains, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The ruins no longer felt like a grave. They felt like the first stones of a foundation, one that he and his daughter would build together, no matter how long it took. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the whisper of the wind, Ashthorne began, very faintly, to feel alive again. The weeks had settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely reassuring. Each morning Daniel rose before the sun, the chill of the mountains still clinging to the air, and began the day's work with the quiet determination of a man who had long since learned that no one else would fight his battles for him. Emily followed, sometimes groaning, sometimes eager, but always present, her reluctance slowly dissolving into a wary sense of belonging. The general store now resembled a place fit for living rather than hiding, and though the rest of Ashthorne remained a skeleton of wood and dust, There were sparks of life where once there had been only silence. The garden plot showed its first green shoots, timid but stubborn, and the stove in the corner of the store warmed their evenings with the promise of stability. Yet the town still felt vast and hollow, full of unspoken questions, its shadows deep with secrets that pressed in from every direction. It was Emily who first drew Daniel toward the old mining office at the edge of town. She had developed a fascination with the abandoned buildings, wandering carefully among them when her chores were finished, scavenging for scraps of history. She returned often with small treasures clutched in her hands, an old spoon, a cracked photograph, a child's shoe worn to paper thinness. One evening she came back with excitement flickering in her eyes and told him there was one building different from the rest. Unlike the saloon with its sagging porch or the church with its bell tower leaning like a broken tooth, the mining office still stood with a kind of stubborn dignity. Its walls were thicker, its roof bowed but not collapsed, its door still locked by a heavy rusted chain. Daniel felt something stir at her words, a recognition that this was no ordinary ruin. The mine had been the heart of Ashthorne once, the reason for its birth and the cause of its death. If any place still carried the truth of what had happened here, it would be there. The next morning he led Emily to the office, carrying a crowbar he had salvaged from the pile of tools in the store. The building loomed at the far end of the street, its windows clouded with decades of grime, the chain across its doors brittle with rust. When he struck it with the crowbar, the links shattered with a sound that echoed down the empty road like the crack of thunder. Emily flinched, looking nervously over her shoulder as though expecting ghosts to answer. Daniel swung the doors open, and they groaned as if reluctant to reveal what they had guarded for so long. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint metallic tang of old iron. Shelves lined the walls, their contents collapsed into heaps of moldy paper and rusted tools. A desk stood in the center, covered with ledgers whose pages had fused together into brittle blocks. Daniel and Emily moved carefully, disturbing clouds of dust that swirled in the shafts of sunlight, slicing through the broken shutters. He opened one of the ledgers, its ink faded but still legible, and traced the rows of numbers with his finger. Shipments, wages, equipment costs, records of lives once bound to the rhythm of the mine. Yet something about the columns struck him as odd. Figures were crossed out, rewritten, shifted. Profits shrank suddenly, then vanished entirely, as though a river had been dammed overnight. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel grew more certain that these were not the simple accounts of a dying mine. There was intent here, a deliberate hand twisting numbers into lies. Emily, who had been rummaging near the back wall, called to him with urgency. He found her crouched near a corner where the floorboards bore marks of disturbance. She pointed to a section where the planks did not align perfectly with the rest. Kneeling, he pressed against them and felt the faint give beneath his hand. Together they pried at the edges until one board came loose with a long, splintering groan. Beneath it lay darkness, the scent of cold earth drifting up. Daniel widened the gap with the crowbar until the hole revealed a narrow staircase descending into shadow. Emily hesitated, but he lit a lantern they had brought and motioned her to follow. The stairs creaked under their weight, leading them into a basement that smelled of damp stone and mildew. What they found there was unlike anything else in Ashthorne. Stacks of crates were piled neatly against the walls, their lids nailed shut, their surfaces marked with faded stencils. Daniel pried one open and found inside a collection of neatly bound ledgers, each wrapped in oilcloth. He opened one, and the entries leapt out at him like accusations. These were no ordinary records. They detailed not only the official shipments, but a hidden column of figures, quantities of ore unreported, values inflated, debts fabricated. Names appeared again and again, signatures appended in an unnaturally neat hand. He remembered the child's journal Emily had found in the schoolhouse, the words about a father who insisted the mine was still rich. Here was the proof. The mine had not failed. It had been closed deliberately, stripped of its worth on paper, while its veins still pulsed with wealth. The people of Ashthorne had been abandoned, robbed not by nature's limits, but by the greed of men. In the far corner of the basement, beneath a stack of broken chairs, Daniel found something heavier, an iron safe, its surface pitted with rust but intact. He worked at it for hours using the crowbar, a hammer, anything he could find. At last the lock yielded with a deafening crack, and the door swung open. Inside lay a collection of small bars wrapped in cloth, their edges gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Gold. Alongside them were stacks of old bonds and certificates, documents bearing the names of long-forgotten investors. Emily stared in awe, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. To her, the sight was dazzling, the promise of a future she had never dared imagine. To Daniel, it was something more complicated. Wealth, yes, but also danger. The moment such a discovery became known, others would come, people far stronger, far more ruthless, who would not hesitate to take it by force. He closed the safe and rested his hand against the cold metal, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon him. That night, as they sat by the stove, Emily could not contain her excitement. She spoke in a rush, her words tumbling over each other about all they could do now. Rebuild the houses, buy supplies, maybe even invite others to live here again. Daniel listened, his eyes on the fire, his thoughts heavy. He did not want to dampen her joy, but he knew better than to believe wealth came without cost. He had seen too much in his life, both in the mines and in the world beyond, to trust that gold would bring anything but more struggle. Still, he let her dream aloud, because her voice was alive in a way he had not heard since her mother died. In the days that followed, Daniel hid the ledgers and sealed the safe again, burying it beneath crates as though covering a grave. He told Emily they must keep what they had found a secret, at least until he could think of what to do. She agreed reluctantly, though her eyes often strayed toward the mine office with restless hope. He spent long hours studying the ledgers, tracing the patterns of fraud until the picture became clear. The town had been destroyed not by chance but by deliberate theft. Its people sacrificed so a few men could grow fat on their misery. The injustice burned in him, though he kept it locked behind his stern silence. Yet secrets have a way of whispering into the world. One evening, as Daniel carried wood from the edge of town, he noticed a faint shimmer of smoke curling up from the valley beyond the ridge. It was not from their stove. Someone else had been near. He remembered the tire tracks, the broken fence post, the feeling of unseen eyes. Ashthorne was not as forgotten as it appeared, and if word of gold or hidden records reached the wrong ears, the ruin they were rebuilding would become a battleground. Emily sensed it too. Though she still spoke of dreams and plans, she grew quieter in the evenings, her eyes lingering on her father with questions she did not ask. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders and held her close, as if to shield her not only from the wind, but from the storm he felt gathering beyond the mountains. The mine had given them more than relics and wealth. It had given them a truth sharp enough to cut through the silence of the past, a truth that could not remain buried forever. And so Ashthorne, which had begun to stir faintly with life, now held within its fragile heart a secret both precious and perilous. Daniel lay awake that night listening to the restless breath of the wind and knew that the trials they had faced so far were nothing compared to what was coming. For gold never slept quietly, and lies left too long in the dark eventually clawed their way into the light. The discovery in the mine office did not leave Daniel's thoughts. Though he and Emily had sealed the basement and returned to their routine of repairing roofs and clearing streets, the weight of what lay hidden beneath those boards pressed on him with every waking moment. The golden documents represented more than just wealth. They were the buried truth of Ashthorne's death, a truth that could topple powerful men if ever brought into the light. Daniel kept the ledgers tucked beneath loose floorboards in the general store, their presence gnawing at him like a secret too heavy to carry. He knew they would not remain theirs alone forever. For a brief while, however, father and daughter allowed themselves the fragile illusion of peace. The garden sprouted with timid shoots, and the patched roof of the store no longer leaked when the rains came. Emily's laughter returned more often, shy but genuine, spilling into the evenings as she told stories of the town she imagined from the relics she had collected. Daniel listened, his heart warmed by the sound, but behind his quiet smile lurked vigilance. He often walked the edges of the town at dusk, scanning the hills for signs of movement, his miner's instincts sharpened now into a kind of soldier's watchfulness. The first real intrusion came one cloudless afternoon when a truck rolled slowly into Ashthorne, its tires kicking up a plume of dust. Daniel heard the engine before he saw it, and his body went taut with the old reflexes of self-preservation. Emily stood beside him on the porch of the store, her eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. The vehicle stopped in the center of the street, and three men climbed out. They wore neat shirts beneath worn jackets, their boots polished but dusty from the road. One of them, broad-shouldered with a fleshy face and the kind of smile that never touched the eyes, strode forward as though the town belonged to him already. He introduced himself as a representative of a development company from the county seat, though Daniel knew the type well enough to see through the polish. The man spoke with a practiced ease, praising Daniel's initiative in reclaiming this forgotten place and offering to buy Ashthorne for a generous sum. He painted a picture of resorts and vacation homes, tourists filling the empty streets, wealth pouring into the valley. His words flowed like honey, but Daniel felt the poison beneath them. He refused, calmly but firmly, and saw the flicker of irritation pass across the man's face before the smile returned. Over the next days, more visitors came, each with their own mask. Some were smoother, promising help and investment. Others were blunt, offering cash on the spot. When Daniel refused them all, the tone shifted. Notes appeared nailed to the store door, warning him of legal trouble. A man rode past at night and shouted that squatters would be cleared out soon enough. Emily began to sleep poorly, waking at every noise, her newfound peace cracked by the shadow of threat. Daniel reassured her as best he could, but inside he knew the battle he had feared was arriving sooner than he had hoped. The first act of sabotage came quietly. One morning Daniel found their garden trampled, the shoots crushed beneath boot prints. A few nights later he discovered the well fouled with oil, the water undrinkable until he had cleaned it out. He worked late into the night to repair the damage, his anger growing cold and sharp. He had expected as much. Men who came for profit rarely left empty-handed without a fight. But what cut deepest was Emily's fear. She no longer wandered freely among the buildings, but stayed close to him, her eyes flicking constantly to the hills as if expecting figures to emerge from the dusk. It was then that support arrived from an unexpected quarter. A neighboring rancher named Hale, a man with weathered hands and eyes lined by hardship, came to Ashthorne one evening and offered his help. He had heard of the trouble, he said, and he had his own reasons to stand against the men from the county. His family had nearly lost their ranch to a sudden debt they never owed, and only by sheer luck had they managed to hold on to it. Others soon followed, small farmers, widows, laborers who had been pushed to the edge by the same predatory forces. They came quietly offering food, tools, and their own hands for the work of rebuilding. Ashthorne began to feel less like an island and more like the center of a fragile but growing alliance. Daniel accepted their help cautiously, his natural distrust tempered by gratitude. He knew that what they faced was larger than a handful of men with threats. It was a system, greedy and corrupt, that had already crushed the people of Ashthorne once. Yet as neighbors worked beside him, mending fences, hauling water, and keeping watch, he felt a flicker of hope. Emily, too, found new strength in their company. She befriended Hale's granddaughter, a girl her age with quick laughter, and for the first time Daniel saw her running down the street of Ashthorne with another child, her hair flying behind her in the wind. The pressure from the outside did not ease. More letters arrived, this time bearing official seals, accusing Daniel of trespassing on county property and demanding he vacate. One night a barn at the edge of town caught fire, the flames leaping high before neighbors managed to put it out. Daniel's anger hardened into steel. He gathered the group together in the store and laid out the ledgers he had hidden. By lantern light they pored over the documents, their voices low with awe and fury. Here was proof of the fraud, the lies that had stolen Ashthorne and threatened to do the same to them. The room grew quiet as the weight of it settled in. This was not only Daniel's fight, it was theirs as well. Tension built until it reached a breaking point. One afternoon, a convoy of trucks roared into Ashthorne, dust boiling behind them. Men climbed out, some in suits, others rougher, their hands resting too casually on the weapons at their belts. At their head was the broad-shouldered man with the fleshy face, his false smile gone now, replaced by open contempt. He declared loudly that the town was being seized for unpaid debts and that Daniel and his squatters had 1 hour to leave. Emily stood on the porch, her face pale but her chin lifted in defiance, while Daniel faced the man with a calm that masked the fire inside him. The standoff stretched long and taut. The intruders advanced only to find themselves confronted not just by Daniel, but by the ranchers and farmers who had come to stand beside him. They carried no guns, only tools, and the hard resolve of people with nothing left to lose. For a moment it seemed violence would erupt, but Daniel stepped forward, holding up the ledgers. His voice, quiet but cutting, told the man exactly what was inside them. Names, numbers, signatures, all the evidence needed to bring down the men behind the fraud. He said that if Ashthorne were touched again, these papers would find their way to the authorities. The threat hung in the air like a drawn blade. The broad-shouldered man spat into the dust, his eyes burning with rage. But he knew better than to call the bluff. With a barked order, he led his men back into their trucks, engines roaring as they sped away in a cloud of dirt and fury. The people of Ashthorne exhaled as one, relief mingling with fear. The battle had not been won, only delayed. That night, as the stars wheeled silently above the valley, Daniel sat with Emily outside the store. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her body still trembling from the confrontation. He wrapped an arm around her and looked out over the darkened street. The gold in the safe, the documents hidden under their floorboards, these things had placed them in the path of danger. But he no longer saw Ashthorne as a grave. It was their ground, their fight, and their chance to carve a future from the ruins of betrayal. The battle for the town had only just begun, and Daniel knew the storm would return with greater force. Yet as he listened to the steady breathing of his daughter and the faint murmur of neighbors gathered in watchful silence, he felt no desire to run. Ashthorne was no longer only the town he had bought for nothing. It was the town he would defend with everything he had left. The days that followed the confrontation were thick with unease. Ashthorne's single street bore no scars of the standoff beyond a few scuffed boot prints and the memory of raised voices, yet the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Emily moved through her chores with a newfound seriousness, her laughter muted, her eyes always drawn to the horizon as though she expected the trucks to return at any moment. Daniel himself carried the weight of vigilance heavily, though he did not allow fear to show. He worked as he always had, patching walls, repairing fences, tending to their fragile garden. But he knew the reprieve would not last. Men such as those who had tried to drive them out did not accept defeat. They waited, regrouped, and struck again with sharper teeth. But what they had not counted on was the gathering strength of the people who had thrown in their lot with Ashthorne. Hale and the other ranchers remained, their presence transforming the ghost town into a place of quiet resolve. More neighbors began to appear, some curious, others openly offering help, carrying supplies, tools, or simply their hands for labor. The ledgers Daniel had revealed to them had spread their truth like wildfire, whispered from mouth to mouth across the valley. Stories of fraudulent debts and stolen land reached ears far beyond Ashthorne, and with them came outrage and a cautious sense of solidarity. Emily felt the change most keenly. Where once she had wandered through empty streets alone, imagining the lives that had once filled them, now she ran with other children, their voices echoing between the skeletal buildings. The town began to breathe again, its silence no longer oppressive, but alive with the faint murmur of human presence. Daniel watched her from the porch of the store, her face lit with a joy he had feared she might never know again, and felt something in his chest unclench. Still, the threat had not vanished. Letters continued to arrive, though now Daniel met them with calm defiance. Storing them in a pile he refused to dignify with a response. The men behind the fraud pressed their claim through the county courts, but Hale and others carried the ledgers into the hands of lawyers willing to listen. In time, word reached the federal authorities, and Daniel found himself visited not by thugs or false businessmen, but by men in dark suits who listened gravely as he laid the documents before them. Their eyes flicked across the forged signatures, the falsified debts, the precise columns of numbers that told the story of betrayal. When they left, Daniel knew change was coming, though he could not yet imagine its scale. The first arrest came quietly, almost anticlimactically. The broad-shouldered man with the fleshy smile was taken into custody, while dining in a restaurant in the county seat. Others followed, bankers and officials who had profited from Ashthorne's collapse. The news traveled fast, riding the tongues of neighbors and carried on the crackle of radios. For the people who had suffered under the shadow of those men, it was not simply justice but vindication, proof that their pain had not been imagined, that the chains of debt that had strangled them were forged by human hands and could therefore be broken. Daniel did not celebrate openly. He remained cautious, wary of false victories. But when Emily ran to him one evening, her eyes shining as she told him that Hale's ranch was now free of the fabricated claim that had nearly destroyed it, he allowed himself a rare smile. The tide had turned. The battle for the town had been fought with more than hammers and fists. It had been fought with truth, patience, and the stubborn refusal to yield. With the pressure of threat finally lifting, attention turned to rebuilding not simply for survival, but for growth. The people who had gathered in Ashthorne began to stay, their temporary shelters giving way to repairs on the long-abandoned houses. The church was restored first, its bell tower righted and its roof mended, until once again it stood as the town's sentinel against the sky. The saloon followed, reborn not as a den of whiskey, but as a gathering hall where neighbors met to plan and to celebrate. The main street, once choked with weeds, was cleared, its boardwalks repaired, its windows fitted with glass that gleamed in the sun. Daniel poured himself into the work, his body driven by the same relentlessness that had once carried him through the mines. But there was something new in his movements now, something lighter. He no longer labored simply to keep the roof over his daughter's head. He labored to raise a place where she could live, laugh, and grow, where the weight of grief would not press on her shoulders as it had on his. The gold they had found in the safe, carefully portioned and guarded, provided the means. But the true wealth lay in the joined hands of neighbors who refused to let the town die again. By the time summer spread its warmth across the valley, Ashthorne was unrecognizable. The skeleton had grown flesh once more. Gardens blossomed in neat plots, children's laughter filled the air, and cattle lowed from pastures reclaimed from the encroaching wilderness. The town's name was changed, painted in bold letters on a new sign at the entrance to the street. Hope's Landing. The name had been Emily's suggestion, whispered shyly to her father one evening. When the others heard it, they agreed at once. It captured what they had built from dust and despair, what they had wrestled back from the jaws of corruption. For Daniel, the transformation was more than physical. He no longer felt the weight of his own life pressing him into the earth. The grief of his wife's passing had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. Each morning when he rose, he did so with purpose, knowing that his labor carried meaning beyond survival. Each evening, when Emily sat beside him on the porch of the store and leaned her head against his arm, he felt not the emptiness of what he had lost, but the fullness of what he had found. The safe remained hidden, its gold a reminder of the past, but Daniel rarely thought of it. What mattered was not the metal locked away in the dark, but the light that filled the streets outside. Hope's Landing thrived because people believed in it, because they had chosen to bind themselves together against hardship. He had once come here to bury his past, to hide in silence. Instead, he had unearthed not only a truth that toppled the powerful, but also a community that had become his family. One evening, as the sun bled its last light over the mountains, Daniel sat on the porch with Emily and Hale, watching the children play in the street. Emily's hair glowed copper in the fading light, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Daniel felt a peace settle over him, deeper and truer than any silence he had once sought. He looked at the sign at the edge of town, the bold letters of Hope's Landing, and knew he had not only found a home, but built one. The ghost town was gone. In its place stood a promise kept, not just for a father and his daughter, but for all who had been broken and had risen together. And in that promise lay the rebirth not only of Ashthorne, but of Daniel himself. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Trust me, what's coming tomorrow will shock you even more. Check out the other videos on this channel. Each one hides a twist you won't see coming. And if this story left you speechless, share it with your friends. Let them experience the surprise too.